Hello, everyone. Ciao, Teo. Hey, Alex.
Hello.
Hi, Alex. Hi, Luca.
How you doing?
And we have a guest. I'm so happy. I'm happy
Yeah,
when we have guests. So hey, hi.
Happy to be here. Good to see you guys again.
and just maybe Alex, because I don't know how many of you, of the people listening or tuning in, they know about you and Cerbos, but maybe do you want to give an elevator pitch about yourself and a longer story about Cerbos?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Alex Olivier. I'm one of the co-founders and run product at Cerbos, and we are solving a pain I've had to face many, many times myself in previous companies. I know you guys have as well, around how you manage roles and permissions and ultimately authorization inside of applications. So Cerbos is predominantly an open source project that helps you externalize authorization, complicated if-else case switch, check role logic into policy. And then we have a product that helps you kind of manage that from a workflow and a business perspective as well, getting audit logs and insights in terms of how your permissions worked, and which is a topic which affects every bit of software, and definitely one of the topics of where this whole MCP and AI space is going as well.
Yeah,
Can't wait
and
to go to. Can't wait to go here to go to this. Like this is like so much fun.
and I mean, let's maybe start with a little bit of history for everyone, so that everyone knows what the heck this model context protocol really is. I was reading like recently a tweet or a LinkedIn message post, sorry, saying that MCP is the new API for AI. And for a second, I thought about all the organization and enterprise that spend millions of dollars to jump on the API transformation journey, and they haven't completed it yet. And they have a new things to go, right? The MCP.
And now it's MCP, Luca. It's MCP everything.
With all the AI gateways, kind of madness that associate with that. But maybe let's jump into, I don't know who wants actually to take it, but what exactly is this model context protocol? Alex, maybe you are the guest. We give you the honor today.
Give me the. I'll try and give the simple version. So we kind of reached this point with what's going on with these LLMs, where you can provide them with further context for them to do their job. And I think the classic example that was used in a lot of the early implementations was providing tools to these models. So basically, a model is working through some task that it's been given, and at some point it might need to do some action. And LLMs, all they're really doing is predicting the next character that comes out of it. They can't compute necessarily, and that's changing a bit, but you can't compute necessarily. So this idea came along of exposing tools to an LLM. So a tool in a lot of the tutorials is like, let's give it a calculator, and this calculator tool knows how to add two numbers together. And so during its execution, the LLM will decide, okay, the user needs to be able to add two numbers together. I don't know how to do that because I'm just a predictor of the next character or the next token. And so an LLM is given this description of tools available, and it will go through all the tools that has been given and go, all right, there's this calculator thing. I give it two inputs and it will give me back an answer. So the LLM instructs the system that's calling the LLM, go and execute this tool and get back the answer. And that was all quite simple for when all your tools are like built into your AI application. Now, where MCP came along was, okay, well, how do we manage this where those tools may be external to my application? And so now we need a protocol to advertise what tools are available, make them available to some AI app, provide the message format for passing context of how to go and execute tools and get back the response, and not just tools, but also resources and other prompts as well. And ultimately, MCP, at least I understand it, is that new API interface. It's a new way of advertising essentially endpoints, but tools in this case, which have a certain description, they have an input, they have some function, and they have some output. And it's kind of transparent to the LLM of what happens, but the LLM just gets back the answer. And we use this very verbose wire format of English.
With That's actually interesting because it all started a long time ago with trying to formalize the language of system communications, called API, right? And we go back to SOAP, then REST, and GraphQL.
SOAP and WSDLs. Remember those days? Oh.
Well, MCP is not far from this.
No, it has a major difference because, Alex, you haven't got into the major difference between a lot of the other things that Luke has mentioned. Okay, so I think it's very important to unpack that difference. Okay, MCP as a protocol, okay, compared to a lot of other things, supports, of course, a request response pattern. Okay, and you have one. So you have your server. You send a calculator, and it streams back there. It gives back the result. But it also supports a way to execute it when the response is being streamed down. Okay, so a response is a long running task, and that long running task produces some intermediate output that is displayed to the user while the task is being done. Let's make it something simple. Let's say that we are running the tests of an app. You or a command on the shell. You want to see that the progressing output of what is being executed. This is great. Okay, this is how things are supposed to do. But this adds a little bit of complexities to the protocol itself and the implementations. Okay. Especially remote ones, but we need to unpack that. Let's pack that for later, because this is a very important point. Local versus remote MCP. We need to go into that after Luca's point, probably. But I wanted to clarify this is a major difference on the streaming side. Okay, and that makes all the difference to some extent. All these new AI systems, okay, are now streaming data. Okay, while all the previous generation of essentially the previous big tech fad or thing or hype system were all about request response. Now we are all about streaming data. Okay, and this is changes significantly the equation on how you deploy, how you scale, how you manage those systems. So it's very important to note. We have a few sessions on the podcast in the past that we have done for talking about WebSockets, server-side events, implementing streaming services, data streaming services, and so on. You might want to check them out. They are great. Sorry for the self-promo of the banter.
No, we should actually link them. But what was interesting for me is to see being kind of like lived for a while in the enterprise monster. Is to kind of like see how, for example, in SOAP we add our own meaning of authentication. Then in the world of REST or basically OpenAPI and microservices, we went into a completely different direction in this request response model that Matteo was mentioning. We kind of like first started with exposing system to consumers, and then the rise and fall of OAuth and all different descendants. Then we move into the layer 4, layer 7 authentication authorization. And so we went from the traditional X509 with certificate handling to the service mesh that was promising we can, command and control this whole authorization between systems. And then ... What about the MCP space? Because one of the biggest things that I heard in discussion with the OpenAPI Foundation has been the opportunity that there is to kind of like set a new standard for MCP and authentication and authorization. And so my question is, also kind of following up what the OpenAPI has been discussing for a while, to define a standard within the spec itself. But my question is, how do we solve it? What's the major headache in authorizing and authenticating those kind of systems? Because like Matteo was saying, there are mostly streaming interfaces. Well, that's one of the interfaces that they support, but definitely the most wanted. And like you were saying, Alex, this one is just an interface for tools. So if I take a little bit of memory on the table and say, so it should be like a system-to-system integration, right? But then there is a user on the other side. So it's a user to system to system to system to system to user.
I mean, it is the first time I think where a lot of these sort of traditional authorization models we've all thought about need to slightly change. And there's a lot of work going on in both OpenID under the OpenID OAuth working groups and also IETF to help sort of define and tweak sort of how these models should work. And we're now moving to a model where you have tasks that are probably started by a human, but not necessarily, but then that could spin off a chain of asynchronous actions and workloads and things that happen on behalf of non-humans. And we don't really right now have a good model for that. There's lots of work going on around, is this impersonation? Is this delegation? Is this on behalf of? And these are all concepts that kind of exist in sort of the OAuth 2 world, but they need a bit of an evolution and a bit of think of, do you just do a token exchange to get a scoped token? Should the tool that's executing on behalf of the user have the exact same permissions of the user? I would argue no. You actually want to constrain and limit the permissions that an agent, let's say, or a tool ultimately has to do has the access just for what it's trying to do. So yes, it's acting on behalf of Luca or Matteo, but I shouldn't have access to your entire Google account, let's say. I should only have access to the little bit I need to do the task at hand. So there's that, and then also, Matteo, to your point about how these things are like async, streaming, they may cross sessions, or if sessions disconnect. I know you did a lot of work in the MCP to make sure session reconnects work. It's a big challenge. So there's a lot of work going on as something now called transaction tokens as another standard, which is you now issue workloads not only identity for the task they're doing, but you also issue them a token that's only valid for some time period or some scope of a particular transaction. And in this case, the transaction would be the initial call by a user calling n number of tools, going down the chain, etc., and getting a response back. And you can start limiting and issuing identities and authentication mechanisms constrained for particular tool chains, etc. And that's purely just to establish a trusted identity with a limited scope and basically an expiry time on it. Authorization is kind of the next side of things, which is, okay, I now have an identity. Can this identity do this particular action on behalf of this particular user for this particular moment in time with this particular previous call chain? So now you are doing exactly as you said. You have that sort of user to service to service to service to service service n number of type problem to had. And I think we're, as an industry or a standards bodies out there, we're sort of converging this idea of having tokens, and by that JWTs are kind of the standard that's now sort of out there thanks to OAuth, as being the transport for that. And so now you need to make not only authentication decisions, but also authorization decisions based upon the state of the world, the context, and also the tokens that are being used for that particular transaction, which leaves another whole world of session management and that whole pain that comes with it.
I am very skeptical generically on how good the user experience is going to be for this kind of things right now, for this kind of things at the end, because okay, let's imagine the problem. So the problem is very much a lot of the about the user experience, okay? Because let's say I want to connect to a service, okay? Now, and I told my there needs to be this kind of guided automated installation phase in which I need essentially my AI tool that is aware of the MCP needs to essentially contact the MCP service, essentially negotiate an authentication flow, then which I presume is going to be based on OAuth 2, because this is my presumption, okay, my assumption. But OAuth 2 is a nightmare, okay, to implement correctly, with all the things that entail, okay. So it's not a nightmare pure, but it's a lot of work, okay. And then you have all the compatibility dance between different providers and things like that, because it's a standard, but not really, okay. And you need, every single provider has his own sprinkle of quirks that different options for each of them. Okay, we have a fantastic Fastify OAuth 2 library that has all the quirks, and it's funny enough that somebody says, "Oh, this is now not working anymore on this provider." Send me a PR. At this point, I don't have reproduction for most of them. Anyway, going to that point, you need to have these kind of very complex UI, in order to make these tools viable for the general public, you need to have this very complex UI in which you can automate essentially authentication flows, in which I can, as a user, negotiate a session between my tool, which is a local party, a client, okay, the server that needs to have received that, give access to the data, and my data provider dash identity provider that needs to be used to access that data. And this is what Auth 2 is built to handle, which is great. But it's a lot of complicated user flows, very complicated.
Yeah, this was the big shift that happened in the MCP protocol spec about 2-3 months ago now. In the original version of the spec, the MCP client was acting more like a authorization server, not an authorization client, and the MCP server itself wasn't the resource server. So that's now all changed. So your VS Code or Cursor or Claude, or as native MCP port comes along, is now becoming a auth client. There's a concept inside of the auth spec around something called dynamic registration, where you don't have a persistent client set up inside of your IDP for each of your MCP hosts, because that just won't scale. So actually, when someone goes and provisions an MCP server connection inside of their MCP client, be it Claude or whatever, that kicks off a dynamic provisioning registration flow behind the scenes to go and instantiate that instance of the MCP client as a proper OAuth client, and then it has to go through the token exchange and all that process. But to your point, I think we're all quite used to getting that like OAuth login screen where it says here are the pushes you want, and everyone just presses allow and goes on with it. And those are very coarse grain. Ultimately, it's whatever permissions you can fit into a token. When you start looking at what's going on at MCP, where these things are doing all these tools that are exposed by MCP servers are doing very potentially harmful operations on your infrastructure. I think there was it last week, someone's entire database got deleted because one of the LLMs decided they wanted to. We're going to have to get a lot better from a user experience perspective of what those flows and those OAuth flows look like. And there's a whole working group going on right now inside of OpenID looking at exactly that, because we need to do a lot better job, but we also need to do a lot better job of being able to constrain that access based on dynamic context.
Can you drop some links on the auth flow on MCP?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a guy called Aaron Paraki who heads up OAuth or standards at Okta, kind of led a lot of the work on it, and sort of worked a lot on OAuth 2, and there's a great diagram for what this looks like, and you can get like a flow diagram.
And Alex, I have a question for you, or maybe it's a product idea for which Matteo and I are going to get a cut for. But one of the biggest problems with authorization traditionally has always been that authorization is done in a very static way.
Yes.
Like, let's describe it, right? So there is a format, and Cerbos has their own format to describe these rules, and these rules are mechanically applied to any sort of context without knowing or understanding the context, right?
Yes.
It's the developer prerogative to kind of like decide which rule to apply. But I think there is a huge opportunity for which AI can really make good use to this humanity, at least to make our life a little bit easier. And it's exactly in the example that you just gave a minute ago. The AI decided to delete a database, right? And I always kind of like, especially in enterprise, ask myself, how can we make this authorization more supervised and agentic, maybe copiloted? Yeah. And just to give you an example, and I know where I'm going, is sometimes we want to perform operation, but sometimes we don't really use our brain. We just want to do that, and we don't rationalize all the implication that this thing will have. And I think it would be phenomenal to have a more kind of like intelligent authorization that comes back and say, hey, are you really sure that you want to perform this operation? Because you're authorized to do that, but probably you don't understand that having the power doesn't mean that it's a great idea to do it.
Yeah, it's a great point, and it kind of falls into the camp of human in the loop, which is like a general sort of concept that is quite, following the AI trend as much. And a lot of the examples of that originally were more like, before calling a call or doing certain actions on a tool, you prompt the user saying like, I'm going to do this, should I be allowed to do it? So going back to Matteo's earlier point about these flows are quite complicated and the user experience needs to keep up with it, is how do you, on whatever client application you're using to interact with an MCP server, sort of surface those prompts at the right time? And if anyone's played with like Claude Code, there's an option to just like auto accept everything, YOLO mode. And context of like the impact of an operation is a really kind of interesting question. And if we go and look at scenarios outside of AI kind of world where this happens quite a lot, is let's say you are in your bank account and you want to do a bank transfer, and you can maybe send $20 to someone, it's fine. But if you go and transfer, say, $5,000, it will go, hold on a minute. Can you go and do a step-up authentication? Can you go and reconfirm your MFA or do a Face ID or whatever before these actions are confirmed? And there's kind of in all these financial systems, there's risk engines that determine, is this an operation scary? Is this operation expected? Is this operation expected based on Alex's current location, what device he signed in on, time of day, based on historical trends, etc. All that learning that's come from basically protecting very sensitive systems like bank accounts and medical systems, etc. All those systems, I think, are great candidates to start overlaying on what these AI tools are doing. So before a tool goes and executes, it can basically go and run that operation through some sort of risk engine that does the equivalent process and comes back with like, how risky is this operation based on who the user is, where they are, what time of day, but also what the operation is or what the LLMs tried to tell us to do. Those risk engines themselves essentially are probably going to have to be quite clever in understanding like the downstream impact of a change. But I think we're now at a point, particularly with where like observability and telemetry has gone in sort of applications, to really have a better idea on heuristics of what a change might do. And then using these mechanisms that are built into the MCP spec to return prompts and return sort of callbacks essentially to the chain to go and do that. And at the core of it, you're going to need a risk engine and you're going to need some sort of policy framework to understand the context, the risk, the action, what's being asked of the system, what the LLM wants to do, and then make a decision and then have an audit log of that decision inside of that workflow. So it doesn't really... The fact that this is being done by some AI LLM somewhere doesn't really change, I think, the fundamental mechanics or the fundamental components that a good system needs to be from an architecture perspective. We're just applying it to kind of a slightly new context, and leveraging some AI in light of that, it makes sense as well. But I think we just need to look at the solid systems we built historically for these kind of sensitive operations and just apply it to this new context.
Yeah, because I personally think that the world of authorization has been always lacking the concept that AI brought to surface, like the concept of context, of memory, of identifying exactly what is the chain of reaction of all these actions, right? And I think it's always been a very sterile, very Boolean, binary system, right? The true, false, yes, no.
Yeah.
But one of the things that could be super interesting is to see, and I'm very interested on how a functionality, a primitive like authorization, can actually gain value from what AI is doing. I'm not saying to transform it into an AI system. I'm saying, where is the intersection between AI authorization and consumers, right? Because in OpenAPI, there is the new Arazzo spec that kind of like brings to surface the workflow-driven nature of communication, right? And finally, we realize that they are not, a two-step set of goals, but we probably should adjust the protocol to the real-world interaction. Back to Matteo's point, that the UX and DX comes from understanding what is the real world nature of these goals, right? And not just like the just architecture kind of like side of things.
Yeah, I mean, for me, like, obviously I get asked quite a lot of like, what's Cerbos doing with AI? What is Cerbos as an authorization system? What is our view for an AI? And I think these systems are super powerful at kind of the two ends of the system, but I'm scared of keeping it in the middle. And by that, I mean, when you as a business or an application builder are trying to work through and design a model, like what your permissioning structure should be and what your authorization logic should be, great, go and throw an LLM at your PRD documents and your historical behavioral logs and have one of these systems help you generate policy that matches both the technical and the business requirements. And I also think it's super useful at the other end when you've got to start going undercover and discovering, roles that may be over under provisioned or policies that maybe are no longer relevant or not being used, and kind of mine that data set. I think where we need to be very deterministic though is the engine that evaluates policy. Like that, you don't want some hallucinations to start appearing and suddenly this thing starts granting access left, right, and center.
Yeah.
So it's all about ultimately feeding the right context. Where that context comes from, I think, is a very interesting discussion. But the actual engine itself that is evaluating real-world decisions against real-world data, be it triggered by a human or some sort of AI, should be very deterministic and monitored and audited in its nature.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think the introduction of MCP and the kind of like rise of need of authorization in this kind of like more non-homogeneous system is kind of like surfacing once again what you just said, the importance of like setting a different type of bar, right, on systems that by legacy that were designed to fulfill certain use cases. For example, I'm in the world of Node, right? That's where we swim. For us was a very interesting exercise to kind of like think how we can actually bring easy access to MCP without having to reinvent the wheel, right? And so maybe Matteo, you can spend a couple of minutes talking about our effort in bringing.
Yeah, it's so the biggest, the hardest part that we needed to let's take a little bit of step back. MCP as the first edition essentially was born essentially as a local thing that you were running via NPX, mostly local execution model. And they were communicating with standard input, standard output with their client, which at the beginning was just Cloud Desktop. Okay. And then from there, it grew to exponential measure to some extent. And now we have remote MCP, okay, with remote servers and stuff. Now, the hardest challenge here was but when you enter the realm of remote connections, okay, you can have these connections. And that is essentially the hardest part, because nobody wants to, start a tool execution, okay, for something, and that tool execution gets you're doing something, the connection drops, and now you don't know, you can know how that ended, okay,
yeah,
and you have no record of how that thing finished, and that is essentially a massive limitation of that system, okay, so. Because that system might not have another user interface or another UI where I can check that operation. So it's very important for the AI client to be able to resume the sessions and know, that connection got interrupted, I reconnect back, and I'm supposed to receive all the missing data in. And that is critical. Okay, so what we have started to do, what we have done, we have essentially implemented. Funny enough, I had a long background on building Internet of Things systems, which have more or less the essentially same kind of challenges. So, and highly concurrent WebSocket servers and so on and so forth. So the net result is essentially this is the same problem. And we have built probably one of the most common architecture, which is using Redis and Redis lists for queuing messages to be sent, and providing some sort of self-expiring history, so we can keep the history going for a while to support resuming, but it can expire over time. And to avoid, because this is a fundamental problem. You, at any given point in time, you never get a receipt back. In the MCP protocol, you stream data down, okay, and you never received an ACK. Okay, this is, from my point of view, a significant mistake in that protocol, okay, because you really want to have an ACK of, okay, I received that chunk, and now you can delete it. I've received the chunk. Okay, this is present in almost all kind of queuing system or pub sub and so on and so forth. Pub subs, and it's not there in this protocol. So in order to, the only way to do that, to support that kind of pattern, is essentially to maintain a certain number of old messages that can be retrieved a little bit in the past, okay, and then expire them essentially with a timeout from the list. And we have implemented all of these, and it works reasonably well, because it kind of solves the problem, okay, of disconnections and reconnections and things like that, which, to be honest, it seems pretty good from my point of view on that side. And otherwise, without these kind of things, you end up, I don't know, you just lose connections, okay, and you lose state, and then when you reconnect, you see all the state was on one server, but I reconnect on another server. So I need to have a certain, I don't know, kind of a session storage, which usually in this case is Redis or Rack Key or whatever you have, or whatever other fork you have of that system. But it's essentially those kind of systems, servers provide the backbone for this kind of part.
Yeah, I mean, let's try and avoid sticky sessions as much as we can. What I think is going to happen, and I think this problem is going to be addressed very soon, because the Claude mobile app, the iOS app particularly, is now going to support MCP natively on iOS. And when people are out with their phones, you're going to be dropping connections all the time. Yeah. And I think one of the big blockers that's been stopped from your ChatGPT, your Claude app on your phones, etc., has been this kind of exact problem, because mobile networks. We've all been there. We Apache networks. I think that's going to be the real test case, and that, I think, the model you've put out with the Platformatic MCP package is one that I'm definitely support going back into the Anthropic spec or the MCP spec, because it needs to be solved. We need more of that pub sub type model for this to actually scale out in those type of environments.
Yeah, also because even thinking about the mobile app, right? So iOS has a pub sub communication mechanism, right, through the Safari endpoint. So for me, when I read that news, the main question that came to mind is, so are we back into trying to break the sandbox in a different way? How long it will take that basically I'm going back to write down on a piece of paper my phone numbers because I'm scared that somebody's gonna take over my phone book, which is, to be honest, a very fair concern, because to me there is a path of acceleration, right, and a path of making sense in the market, and I feel that actually we're accelerating in certain kind of beautiful ideas without actually taking care of stabilizing the major non-functional requirements for this technology to succeed in mass and long-term distribution.
Yeah, I can tell you that the thing that really scares me right now is all these browser use type servers, where it literally takes over your Chrome or whatever and is you. It's like, from someone that builds security software, like from a security posture perspective, that is terrifying. You now have no identity attached to it. And to your point, we're accelerating very quickly down this road with technology decisions which have been great for a demo, but don't have that security model around it. And if that becomes the de facto way of modeling, ChatGPT just released their agents that do exactly that, and I'm like, don't do that. That's terrible.
But don't you think that actually the even scarier thing in this whole process is that we are even building tools that they enable experimentation in production more than actually consolidating technology choices? For me, it's absolutely scary. And I suggest everyone to listen to the podcast between Lex Friedman and DHH, 6 hours long.
It's so long.
And I mean, I couldn't stop taking mental notes out of that conversation. And I think DHH had the perfect representation of what's happening nowadays with AI. We are basically enabling a new generation of developers that they fundamentally don't know what they're doing. So if before they had a little bit of barrier between the not knowing and doing, now we just basically take away any barriers, like a river going down the mountain with no barrier. And I personally am telling you, I've been using
For us
all
that
those
we sell enterprise software, by the way. Okay? By the way.
But I think luckily the enterprise is not running down that path yet, because we saw enough nonsense in years and years of experience in enterprise to basically say if AI comes into play, it's the end, basically. But just to give you a very simple, like, example, I was coding something with a very popular vibe coding tool. And this very popular vibe coding tool that is valued at $1.8 billion nowadays, that claims to have $100 million in ARR when they're only 8 months old. So I think they already, broke the barrier of time and space, which is great because they are even beyond what Einstein could prove. So kudos to them. Kudos to the industry that is able to kind of like promote such a nonsense. But I was actually trying to ask this magnificent tool to basically write a simple authentication, like something that usually doesn't take more than an npm install, and thanks to the great open source software, 50 lines of configuration. And this thing was able to burn almost $200 in token without telling me, because clearly that's the other side. And yet there is basic authentication. So I look at the code that he generated. I give him, and I want to give to this tool a human identity. This brilliant tool generated. And basically, I think with first year of high school hacking technique, you could brute force the database and get out all information without even passing through the API, because they forgot to put, once again, authentication authorization on every API.
I mean, isn't the kind of the meta point there is all these models have been trained on the code that's on the internet, and that just shows how much bad code is out on the internet for you to copy and paste off Stack Overflow.
I am not 100% like those tools right now, current generation, whatever, more or less does what it's told to do, and try to do it in the in the laziest possible way, or the only way that it knows. And the point is, if the business owner, product manager, whatever, tells you, oh, I don't want to put authorization on this endpoint, it's fine for the business, just ship it. Well, you probably will going to scream to their boss and throw a rock at them and says, look, this guy doesn't understand a thing. Okay, you cannot ship without authorization in our organization. Okay. But with these kind of tools, they don't do that. Okay, they don't have that sensibility probably. They're not. They can't do that right now, at least. So I have a rough feeling, and I don't presume they will be, but maybe there is a glimmer of hope, maybe. But there is other problem in these tools is how the current set of what they try to do. Okay, if you look, for example, at the a lot of these tools use framework like Next.js as the backbone of their API. Okay, And you know where you're going, Alex. So they are the famous guys, okay, that have been put out a lot of demos out there of receiving inputs from APIs, not validating those inputs, putting those inputs as parameter on a SQL query, okay? And from me, if I have anything going into a database, it should be properly validated, sanitized, make it, square completely. So it's
this is the sensor, is the AI sensor.
Yeah.
It's actually no, seriously. They are listening to us because
there we go. We've been uncensored by the AI now.
Matteo, you got censored by the AI because when you were saying something, the AI blocked you.
It blocked me. Blocked
and
me.
Yeah. But did you guys hear about the OpenAI note? Sam Altman said, "Hey, just remember, when you chat with OpenAI, those one are not secrets. They can be disclosed in core because there's no such a thing as client attorney confidentiality." And I was like, so now answer to this question, mastermind. How can you train your model to work efficiently inside of an enterprise where every enterprise has something called corporate secret? Just question mark. The thing is, I think we are reaching, our average episode time. But what I wanted to close with is just like a note and then a question. The note is, we are actually just at the beginning of this journey, right? And like I said, I think one observation I can make is we are going extremely fast, and accelerating crazily without looking backward and kind of like learning from all these years of building software. And we are trying to build a new generation of software. But my question is mostly to you, Alex, building a software that, like ours, fits the enterprise, right? So where do you see the world of your space authorization going in the next, let's say, 3 to 5 years? So that's the deadline that they gave us for really AGI. I quote you, Demis Hassabis.
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of terrifying if you're going to believe all these future state problems of what AGI is going to bring and everything else is redundant. I think what it really means as enterprise businesses, we've already got governance processes. And I think now is a time where we get real about those, not just from a tick box type process. This met all our compliance and regulatory needs. Let's ship the release and off we go. We actually need to start taking those ultimately, written in English rules about what can and shouldn't and follow and must be processed, and actually turning that into something that it can be enforced by software. And that is policy-based, real-time, and contextual. So policy-based, i.e. you have an asset that you can version, test, and audit that defines your policy and that is followed. We're going to have to move to a model where those policies are being evaluated in real time. So every decision, be it made by a human, an agent, some future AGI, Skynet, whatever you want to call it, every action it decides to do must go through that policy and is doing that on every request. You can't just trust a token issued at authentication time. And contextual. So going back to what we were saying earlier about those kind of risk engine type things, every decision must be made understanding the full context of what's happened, what's about to happen, and the expected outcome of that. And I mean, just selfishly, I believe that the only way you can do that is by externalizing this into policy and something like Cerbos. There's others out there, and to do it. And then we need to make sure that those guardrails are in place around whatever tools, whatever models, whatever AI agents, whatever future state things we put in place, and make sure every decision goes through a system such as this. So we still have the controls as the human overlords of this software before it goes around and becomes our overlord.
Alex, thanks a lot for being here. And
we want to
give a great shout out to what you guys are building with Cerbos. Matteo and I have been huge fans of your work since the inception, and we continue to be extremely excited about what you guys are bringing to life. And once again, we thank you a lot for being here, sharing your insights with us and everyone listening in. And yeah, we cannot wait to have you again. Until then, yeah, we see Matteo. We see each other next week then, like every week, same time, same place.
Same time, same place, guys.
All right.
Ciao, everyone.
Thank you very
Ciao,
much.
Bye. Thank
Take
you,
care.
Alex.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye. Bye.